The evening sky dimmed, painting the city in hues of deep orange and purple as the last remnants of daylight clung to the horizon. The streets, lined with patches of icy snow, were already quiet as people hurried home before the biting cold took hold. A winter storm was on its way, and the air carried the kind of chill that seeped into bones, warning anyone caught outside to seek shelter. Isaiah, a 10-year-old black boy, trudged through the streets, his breath visible in the freezing air. His worn-out jacket, barely thick enough to keep out the cold, clung to his small frame as he pulled it tighter around himself. The city lights flickered on as businesses closed up, their warmth and glow only a painful reminder of the things Isaiah didn't have. People didn't notice him as they passed, just another kid in the background, someone they assumed had no place among them. But Isaiah didn't care. He had learned to navigate a world that often judged him before he even spoke. The weight of those assumptions pressed on him daily, but tonight something far more urgent demanded his attention. A sound, faint, almost drowned out by the wind. A cry. Isaiah stopped, his breath catching. His dark, brown eyes scanned the empty street, searching. The noise came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. Someone needed help. He turned sharply, following the sound to a small park across the street. The streetlights barely reached the edges of the park, casting long shadows over the frozen ground. At first, all he could see was snow, untouched and thick. But then, near a frozen bench, he spotted something. No, someone. A small figure, curled up against the cold, barely moving. Isaiah's stomach clenched. He rushed forward, his feet crunching against the snow. As he neared, he saw the boy, a young white kid no older than 7 or 8, dressed in a thick, fur-lined coat, expensive gloves, and winter boots. But none of it seemed to be enough. His pale skin had taken on an eerie bluish tint, his lips quivering as his small body trembled violently. His eyes, half-lidded and unfocused, barely registered Isaiah's presence. Kneeling beside him, Isaiah shook his shoulder gently. "Hey, hey, you gotta wake up," he urged, his voice filled with urgency. The boy let out a weak whimper, his breath barely visible in the freezing air. Isaiah knew he didn't have much time. He had seen what the coal could do to people, how it could steal the warmth from their bodies until there was nothing left. He wasn't going to let that happen. Without hesitation, he pulled off his own thin jacket and wrapped it around the boy's fragile frame. The cold immediately sliced through Isaiah's body, but he gritted his teeth. This kid needed it more. The boy's lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "Cold." "I know," Isaiah said, shivering as the wind picked up. "But you gotta stay awake. I'm gonna get you somewhere warm, okay?" He glanced around desperately. The streets were still empty, and calling for help wasn't an option. No one would hear him in time. He had only one choice. Bracing himself, Isaiah hooked his arms under the boy's limp body and lifted him up. He was lighter than expected, but carrying him through the icy streets wouldn't be easy. Every step sent sharp stings through Isaiah's feet as the snow bit through his shoes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The world might have always overlooked him, dismissed him as just another kid from the wrong side of the city. But tonight, Isaiah was the only thing standing between life and death. The cold gnawed at Isaiah's fingers as he clutched Matthew tightly, his own thin shirt doing little to protect him from the icy wind. His breath came in short, visible puffs as he trudged through the empty streets, searching for warmth, for safety, for anything that could save the boy in his arms. Isaiah had always known hardship. It was the only thing that had been consistent in his life. From the moment he was old enough to understand the world, he had been fighting against it. He had been labeled early on a troublemaker, a thug, the kind of kid teachers never gave a second glance to. They saw the hoodie, the worn-out sneakers, the neighborhoods he walked through, and they assumed they already knew his story. But Isaiah wasn't what they thought he was. Despite everything, he still believed in doing the right thing. His mother had raised him to be better than the world expected of him, even if she had never been able to shield him from its cruelty. She had worked long shifts, trying to keep food on the table, but the struggle had been endless. When she had passed away, Isaiah had been left to navigate the world alone. He had learned to survive on his own, to be tough when he needed to be, but he had never let it harden him. And now, even though the boy in his arms was a stranger, even though Matthew would have likely never spared Isaiah a second glance under normal circumstances, Isaiah wouldn't let him die out here. Matthew came from a different world, one Isaiah had only ever seen through the windows of passing cars or on television screens. His father, a powerful businessman, had built his empire on ruthless decisions and unshakable privilege. He was the kind of man who never had to worry about where his next meal would come from, who had the luxury of believing that wealth meant superiority. He had raised Matthew with those same beliefs, teaching him that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who had power and those who didn't. Isaiah knew that if their roles had been reversed, if he had been the one freezing to death in the snow, Matthew likely wouldn't have looked twice at him. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Isaiah could feel Matthew's body growing colder, his shallow breaths slowing. "Hey," Isaiah muttered, shaking him slightly. "Stay awake, man. You hear me?" Matthew's eyes fluttered, but his lips barely moved. He was slipping away. Isaiah gritted his teeth and picked up his pace, his muscles burning from the effort of carrying another person through the snow. The weight of Matthew's privileged life pressed against him, not just physically, but in the deeper unspoken way that divided their worlds. This boy had never had to worry about survival. He had never known hunger, never felt the sting of being judged before he even spoke. And yet, Isaiah wasn't thinking about any of that. He wasn't thinking about how unfair it all was. He was just thinking about getting Matthew to safety. Up ahead, Isaiah spotted the glow of a convenience store sign cutting through the night. He pushed forward, his frozen fingers slipping slightly as he adjusted his grip on Matthew. The warmth inside would be enough to keep him alive until Isaiah could find real help. With the last of his strength, he shoved the door open and stumbled inside. The warmth hit him immediately, but there was no relief, not yet. An older man behind the counter looked up, startled. His eyes flickered over Isaiah's face, his torn clothes, the way he was carrying the unconscious white boy in his arms. Isaiah saw the suspicion in his expression before he even spoke, but he didn't have time for assumptions. "He needs help," Isaiah gasped, his breath ragged. "He's freezing. Call someone." The store clerk hesitated for just a second too long, his eyes darting between the two boys, doubt clouding his face. Isaiah clenched his jaw. If Matthew had been conscious, if he had been the one carrying Isaiah, there wouldn't have been any hesitation. But Isaiah had no time for anger. All he could do was fight to make sure Matthew got to live long enough to see the world for what it really was. The wind cut like a blade against Isaiah's skin as he trudged through the deepening snow, his breath coming in quick, uneven puffs. The cold burned his fingertips, numbing them despite the thin fabric of his gloves. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Matthew was barely conscious now, his shivers weakening by the second. That wasn't good. Isaiah had watched enough people suffer through the cold to know that the moment you stopped shaking was the moment your body started giving up. He wasn't going to let that happen. "Come on, man, stay with me," Isaiah muttered under his breath, tightening his grip around Matthew's frail body. He had already stripped off his own jacket, wrapping it around the rich boy's shoulders. The bitter wind bit at Isaiah's arms, but he ignored it. He had grown up in conditions like this. The cold didn't scare him. But what did scare him was the possibility that he might not get Matthew to safety in time. The weight of Matthew's privilege pressed against him, not in the physical sense, but in the cruel irony of their situation. Here was a boy who had likely never known real hunger, never had to worry about where he'd sleep at night, never been judged before he even opened his mouth. And yet he was helpless now. His money, his last name, none of it could save him. But Isaiah could. Each step felt heavier than the last as he pushed forward through the snow. The street was mostly empty, save for a few passers-by bundled in expensive coats, their faces barely visible under thick scarves. They spared Isaiah a glance, but none of them stopped to help. They saw what they wanted to see. A black boy carrying an unconscious white kid looking ragged, desperate. They didn't see the hero. They didn't see what was really happening. Isaiah could feel their judgment like needles against his skin, but he kept moving. A woman in a fur coat stepped out of a shop, her hands full of holiday shopping bags. Her eyes landed on Isaiah, then on Matthew, and immediately her face twisted with suspicion. "Hey, what are you doing with that boy?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Isaiah didn't stop walking. He didn't have time for this. "He needs help," he said, his voice firm but urgent. "Call 911. The woman didn't move. She was still looking at him like he was the problem, like he was the danger. Isaiah gritted his teeth and kept going. He didn't have time to waste on convincing people that he wasn't a threat. The only thing that mattered was getting Matthew somewhere warm before it was too late. A convenience store was just ahead, its neon sign flickering in the dimming light. Isaiah's arms were aching, his body screaming at him to stop, but he pressed forward. He pushed through the glass door and into the warmth of the store, the sudden heat making his skin tingle painfully. The clerk behind the counter looked up, startled. His eyes flickered over Isaiah's face, then down to Matthew's motionless form. For a second, the room was silent. "Please," Isaiah panted, his voice raw. "He's freezing." The clerk hesitated. Isaiah could see it happening in real time, the judgment, the assumptions, the questions forming in the man's mind. He didn't trust what he was seeing. Isaiah's patience snapped. "Call 911, he shouted, his voice cracking. That seemed to jolt the man into action. He grabbed the phone, dialing with shaking fingers. Isaiah didn't wait to hear the conversation. He dropped to his knees, lowering Matthew carefully onto the floor. The warmth of the store was hitting them both now, but it wasn't enough. Isaiah rubbed Matthew's arms, trying to generate heat. The boy's lips were tinged blue, his breathing shallow. "Come on, man," Isaiah murmured, shaking him lightly. "Don't quit on me now." The store door swung open again, and suddenly there were more voices, footsteps. A paramedic's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. "We've got him." Isaiah felt someone gently pull him back as the medical team moved in. He didn't resist. His entire body felt like it had been drained of strength. He sat back, breathing hard, watching as the professionals did what he couldn't. As they lifted Matthew onto a stretcher, someone, a different store clerk maybe, knelt beside Isaiah, draping a thick blanket over his shoulders. "You okay, kid?" the voice asked. Isaiah nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He had done what he could. Now, it was up to them. The judgment, the assumptions, the stares, all of it had tried to stand in his way. But in the end, none of it mattered, because Isaiah had just saved a life. As the ambulance doors swung open, paramedics swiftly lifted Matthew onto the stretcher, their movements precise and efficient. The store's harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the ice, still clinging to his expensive jacket. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. And that was because of Isaiah. Isaiah stood back, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His fingers were numb, his body shivering from the cold he had endured without his jacket. Someone had draped a blanket over his shoulders, but it did little to stop the deep chill seeping into his bones. He wasn't sure if it was from the winter air or from the weight of the night's events. A man in a dark suit rushed into the store, his heavy footsteps echoing against the tile floor. The moment he saw Matthew, his eyes widened in sheer panic. "Oh, my God, Matthew!" The voice was deep, authoritative, almost threatening. Isaiah instinctively tensed, his hands clenching into fists, prepared for yet another confrontation. The man shoved past everyone, falling to his knees beside the stretcher. His neatly styled hair was slightly disheveled, his tailored coat barely affected by the cold. He reached for Matthew's hand, gripping it tightly. "Son, wake up," he pleaded, his voice raw. Isaiah's stomach twisted. He knew who this was, Matthew's father, Richard Whitmore, a man known throughout the city for his wealth, his power, and his open disdain for people like Isaiah. A paramedic placed a firm hand on Richard's shoulder. "He's stable, but we need to get him to the hospital immediately. His body temperature dropped dangerously low, but he's responding." Richard barely acknowledged them. His entire focus was on his son. Then, as if suddenly realizing there was more to the story, his gaze flicked up and landed on Isaiah. For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. Isaiah could see the exact moment Richard's relief was replaced with confusion, then something sharper. The businessman's blue eyes scanned Isaiah's worn-out clothes, the torn sleeves of his sweater, the frost-bitten fingers gripping the blanket around him. There was no gratitude in his stare, only disbelief. "You," Richard's voice was low, almost dangerous. "Who are you?" Isaiah didn't flinch. He had faced worse. "I found him in the snow. He was dying. I carried him here." A sharp intake of breath filled the room. Even the store clerk, who had been watching from behind the counter, looked between Isaiah and Richard with wide eyes. "You expect me to believe that?" Richard scoffed, straightening up. "That my son just happened to be saved by someone like you?" The word stung, but Isaiah didn't let it show. He had heard worse. He had lived through worse. "I don't care what you believe," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "I did what I had to do." Before Richard could respond, a weak voice interrupted them. "Dad!" Everyone turned sharply. Matthew's eyes fluttered open, his face still ghostly pale, but there was a clarity in his expression that hadn't been there before. He was awake, alive. Richard immediately softened, leaning in. "Matthew, I'm here. You're safe." Matthew swallowed, his throat dry. His gaze shifted past his father to Isaiah. For a moment he simply stared. The last thing he remembered was the unbearable cold, the feeling of his body shutting down. Then warmth, a voice telling him to hold on. Strong arms carrying him through the snow. Isaiah. His father followed his gaze, his features tightening again. "Did he hurt you?" A deep silence filled the room. Matthew blinked, his sluggish mind processing what his father had just said. His father, the man who had always taught him to be wary of people like Isaiah, was still blind to the truth. "No," Matthew whispered, his voice hoarse but firm. "He saved me." Richard flinched as if struck. The room held its breath as Matthew tried to sit up, the paramedics gently keeping him still. His gaze never left Isaiah. "You didn't have to," Matthew murmured. "Why did you—" Isaiah shrugged, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes on him. "Because you were dying." Matthew's expression twisted, something between guilt and realization settling deep within him. He had grown up believing people like Isaiah were dangerous, lazy, beneath him. But when he had been at his weakest, when he had needed help the most, it wasn't his wealth or his last name that had saved him. It had been Isaiah. "I was wrong about you," Matthew admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "About everything." Isaiah didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to say, but Matthew wasn't done. "You didn't just save me. You saved me from myself." His father stiffened beside him, but Matthew didn't care. He wasn't afraid anymore. Isaiah held his gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. Maybe, just maybe, Matthew would be different now. Maybe, because of this night, he would start seeing people for who they were, not for what they looked like. And maybe that was enough. As the days passed, the story of Isaiah's heroic act spread throughout the city. It was on the news, in the papers, and all over social media. People who once dismissed him as just another troubled kid from the wrong side of town were now forced to acknowledge the truth. Isaiah was a hero. The once wary glances he received from shopkeepers and pedestrians softened. People who used to cross the street to avoid him now stopped to shake his hand, to thank him for what he had done. For the first time in his life, Isaiah felt seen for who he truly was, rather than the assumptions others had placed on him. Yet, despite the praise, Isaiah remained the same. He still walked the same streets, still kept to himself, still didn't expect anything from anyone. But there was one person who refused to let him fade into the background: Matthew. Matthew's recovery and transformation. The first time Matthew asked to see Isaiah, it was in the hospital. Wrapped in blankets, hooked up to monitors, he had one request before he was discharged: to speak with the boy who had saved his life. When Isaiah entered the hospital room, Matthew smiled, but Isaiah hesitated. He had never been in a place like this before. White walls, beeping machines, nurses moving in and out. It was foreign to him, just like the wealthy world Matthew came from. "You really okay?" Isaiah asked, shifting awkwardly at the door. Matthew nodded. "Because of you." A deep silence settled between them. Then Matthew did something unexpected. He reached out his hand. Isaiah stared at it, unsure. "Thank you," Matthew said. Isaiah hesitated for only a second before shaking his hand. Matthew's decision. What happened next was even more shocking. Days after leaving the hospital, Matthew made a bold decision, one that rocked the entire city, but most of all, his own family. He wanted to adopt Isaiah. The idea was met with resistance, especially from his father. Richard Whitmore, the powerful businessman who had built his life on control and racial superiority, was livid. He refused to accept it, refused to believe his son would do something so outrageous. But Matthew, once sheltered and obedient, had changed. Facing death had shown him what truly mattered, and Isaiah's selflessness had shattered every belief he had grown up with. "My life was in his hands, Dad," Matthew told him, "and he saved me without hesitation. You always taught me to judge people by their status, but Isaiah proved that kindness and bravery aren't about wealth. I can't ignore that." Richard fumed, but for the first time, Matthew wasn't afraid of him. The media caught wind of Matthew's decision, and the controversy spread. People took sides. Some praised him for breaking away from his father's ideals, while others, including many of his family's business associates, saw it as an act of betrayal. But Matthew didn't care. One night, he showed up at Isaiah's temporary foster home. "I meant what I said," Matthew told him. "You saved my life. Let me change yours." Isaiah stared at him, processing the words. "No one's ever wanted me before," he admitted, voice quiet. "Well, I do," Matthew said firmly. "You belong with me." Isaiah had spent his whole life surviving, always expecting the worst. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved more than just survival. The power of redemption. The adoption process wasn't easy. Richard fought it, tried to block it, but Matthew refused to back down. And in the end, against all odds, Isaiah became part of Matthew's family. It didn't erase the past, didn't undo the years of struggle Isaiah had endured, but it gave him something he had never had before, a real home. More than that, Isaiah's story created a ripple effect. People who had once ignored injustice began speaking out. The city, shaken by the truth, began addressing its racial biases and systemic inequalities. Schools started initiatives to help underprivileged kids. Businesses invested in programs to uplift marginalized communities. And at the heart of it all was Isaiah, a boy who had been judged unfairly his entire life, but who had changed everything simply by doing the right thing. Matthew, now his brother, stood by him every step of the way, using his influence to dismantle the toxic ideals he had once accepted without question. As they stood together at a press conference, answering questions about their unexpected bond, a reporter asked Isaiah how it felt to be called a hero. Isaiah thought for a moment before answering. "I don't think I did anything special," he said. "I just did what any decent person would do. The only difference is, people finally saw me for who I really am." The crowd fell silent, absorbing his words. And for the first time in his life, Isaiah knew he wasn't invisible anymore. Isaiah's story was never just about saving one life. It was about challenging an entire system of beliefs that had been ingrained for generations. His one act of bravery had set off a chain reaction that no one could have foreseen. He had forced people to look beyond the surface, beyond assumptions, and into the heart of what truly defines a hero. In the days following the rescue, Matthew's transformation continued. He became vocal about the way he had been raised, speaking openly about the privilege he had never questioned before. He no longer saw the world through the lens of his father's prejudices. Instead, he saw it through Isaiah's eyes, through the struggles, the resilience, and the kindness that had been overlooked for too long. For Isaiah, the shift was both overwhelming and surreal. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid him were now reaching out, eager to hear his story. But he remained the same boy he had always been, humble, compassionate, and unshaken by the attention. He hadn't saved Matthew for praise or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. The city, too, began to change. Conversations that had once been silenced were now happening openly. Schools began implementing new diversity programs. Businesses started investing in underprivileged communities, and people who had once ignored inequality were finally acknowledging it. Isaiah's courage had not only saved Matthew, it had awakened an entire city, to the biases they had long accepted as normal. But the most significant change came within Matthew's own home. His father, Richard, had spent years building his success on a foundation of power and exclusion. He had never questioned his beliefs, never considered that he might be wrong. But seeing his own son defy everything he had taught him made him pause. He watched as Matthew, the boy he had raised to follow in his footsteps, stood firmly beside Isaiah, refusing to let go of the bond they had formed. For the first time in his life, Richard felt uncertain. He had spent decades believing that people like Isaiah were different, lesser. And yet, here was a boy who had risked his life to save his own flesh and blood. A boy who had done more for his family than any of his wealthy associates ever had. The realization was unsettling, but it was impossible to ignore. The final turning point came on the night of a community event organized in Isaiah's honor. The mayor had invited him to speak, to share his perspective on what had happened. The crowd was filled with reporters, community leaders, and people from all walks of life who had been moved by his story. Isaiah stepped up to the podium, his voice steady as he spoke. "I don't want to be seen as a hero," he said. "I just want people to understand that kindness shouldn't be surprising. It shouldn't take a life or death situation for someone to realize that we're all human, that we all deserve respect. I didn't save Matthew because I wanted recognition. I saved him because that's what we should all do for each other, no matter who we are." The room fell silent, and then, slowly, applause began to spread through the crowd. Even Richard, who had remained at the back, found himself clapping, his pride and prejudices breaking under the weight of the truth. As the event ended, Matthew turned to Isaiah and said, "You changed everything." Isaiah smiled, shaking his head. "No," he said, "you changed too." The journey wasn't over. There were still barriers to break, still minds to open. But one thing was certain. Isaiah had proven that real change starts with a single act of courage, and sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can bring about the biggest changes.